What is up? Today we're gonna enjoy a very interesting game between Garry Kasparov against Magnus Carlsen, and we're also going to learn 3 very useful rules from these 2 titans. Before we jump into the game, there was also one very interesting psychological aspect of this game. Nowadays, Carlsen is known for frequently coming to games late and then slowly adjusting every piece that he has, kind of showing who's the boss and putting psychological pressure onto his opponents. However, while preparing this video, I noticed that in the very first encounter between Garry Kasparov and Carlsen, actually Kasparov did just that. In their rapid game, he came late and then started to slowly adjust every piece and then kind of started thinking about the first move. And later, Carlsen confessed that it actually made him feel nervous. So maybe he learned the trick from Garry. Garry is playing white here against a young but already very strong Carlsen. Now here we go for the English opening. So far so good. Both sides just develop their pieces. d4 strikes in the center, potentially threatens to push d5 and drive away the knight. Therefore, after the trade, now we got probably the first interesting moment of the game. So how do you play here as black? Well, there are a couple choices here, obviously. A lot of players came from Blunderville. They're going to play bishop g7 and overlook the fact that this knight is actually hanging right here, and after the trade, white comes with this double attack and wins material. Therefore, this is not a good option. Now, many players who noticed the threat would simply trade off on d4, and if you're a regular viewer of the channel, then you know the rule to take is a mistake. However, so many players don't, so let me explain real quick. The idea is you should avoid unmotivated exchanges. Think about this. Even though it looks like the easiest solution for black, the trade on d4 actually helps white to advance their queen to a better position, open up a diagonal for this bishop, and now white is putting pressure and black achieved nothing. That is why it's good to avoid unmotivated exchanges, and that is why to take is a mistake. So instead, Carlsen just played bishop d7, defending this knight. After that, white castled, black played bishop g7, and now Kasparov played knight takes c6. By the way, how about the rule to take is a mistake? Well, we gotta be lenient with Kasparov. You know, I started this channel back in 2012, and this game was played prior to that, so Garry had no chance to learn the rule. But jokes aside, of course, I'm talking about unmotivated exchanges. In this case, after black played bishop g7, there is some potential pressure and some tactical ideas around black attacking this knight, and therefore now there is a reason to why white plays this move. It's not just an unmotivated exchange for the sake of exchange. Here there is a reason. That's why knight takes c6 is good. Now black recaptured with the bishop, and now Kasparov was probably thinking, what would the goat play here? And then he recalled that Fischer said that e4 is best by test, and he played e4. Now, again, let me be more serious. Now, here e4, of course, justified because it is indeed the classical example of to take is a mistake. Again, lots of players would take there, which is wrong because first off, there is no threat. Your bishop is already guarded, so there is no need to do anything. But secondly, if you take right there, that actually would open up this b file for the rook. Now, this pawn controls this square, so you can never jump with your knight forward there anymore. Moreover, maybe in the future, black will play d5 and grab the center themselves. Therefore, bishop takes c6 would be a positional error. And instead, Kasparov goes pawn e4, grabbing the center. Black castles. And now Kasparov played the right move, but I've been coaching shots for the last 15 years, so let me also tell you one common mistake that I see over and over. In positions like that, or in general, in different opening positions, very often people feel the urge to start attacking, and they start jumping forward with moves like knight to d5, kind of trying to put pressure or attack something. And here's the problem. That move is a positional error, due to a classical positional rule which states that you gotta complete your development before attacking. And here with knight to d5, it doesn't seem like a problem at first, like what's wrong with this move? And even computer would not tell you that it is a mistake, because computer shows you blunders, but it doesn't show and explain clearly positional errors, and that's why I'm trying to make up for that. So here knight to d5 is actually wrong because you begin your attack prematurely, and black will trade, and after that, again, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but now there is this pressure. So you can't develop your bishop normally because you worry about this pressure to your pawn. And then you think, okay, let me play this move maybe to guard the pawn and then develop the bishop. But all of a sudden your opponent goes bishop f5. You see, oops, now the rook is attacked. What am I going to do here? Well, you have to move the rook away. Then your opponent plays something like rook to c8, attacks this pawn. And you see that he starts building up his attack, and you fall behind in development because you ignored development a couple moves earlier. And then after a couple moves, you're trying to hold on. Now there's already no way to defend this pawn. This pressure is still annoying, this pressure is annoying, and your position actually crumbles within a couple moves. And you don't even understand why, but the reality is it all started back then when you played the move knight to d5, a premature attack before completing your development. Now, of course, Garry knows that, and he plays bishop e3, just completing his development. Now, Carlsen plays pawn a6, aiming for b5 to start his middle game attack, and Garry's prepared. He's going rook c1, putting the rook to this file, which potentially can be opened in case black decides to actually play pawn to b5, plus just bringing the rook into play. And now Magnus plays again the right move, knight to d7, so here b5 would be another common error. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, after the trade, we see this undefended bishop, a loose piece, and those hanging pieces often become vulnerable to different tactics. So here we've got this x-ray from the rook, and there is also one more tactics which Kasparov would probably play. This is the move pawn to e5 with a double attack to this bishop as well as this knight on f6, and white would win the game on the spot. But that's just important to notice how easy this undefended piece becomes vulnerable to winning tactics for white. Now, Carlsen did not play this move, and instead he played knight to d7 to avoid this thing, also to open up this diagonal for the bishop. Garry plays queen e2, again to just complete the development. Once you put out your minor pieces, knights and bishops, it's time to bring your heavy pieces into play, your heavyweights, your queen and rooks. So he goes rook c1, queen e2, and next white wants to play rook d1, bringing all his pieces into play. However, Carlsen strikes first with pawn b5. Now he's ready to do that. And although at first it looks like this pawn is not defended enough because white's got 3 attackers here, the pawn, the knight, and the queen, but in reality, Carlsen calculated it all in case white would take the pawn, which he didn't. After the trade, knight takes b5, now this rook strikes, black has to trade, but at the end of this line, there is this pawn on a2, which is hanging. Carlsen will capture it with a good position, because now he's gaining his pawn back, plus this fianchettoed bishop starts putting pressure, and black is doing well. But Garry once again follows the rule to take as a mistake, and instead he decided to build up the tension, and he played b4, potentially removing this pawn from this pressure, and also just blocking the black pawn from potentially moving forward. So b4 is a pretty interesting move, and now Carlsen also doesn't want to back down, and he plays knight to e5, creating total Magnus. Now the knight hits the pawn right here. White is also attacking. If white captures, this file is going to be opened, and it gets into this more tactical battle. Now the pawn is hanging, white needs to do something about that, white trades, and even after the trade, knight c4 is coming, which would be quite annoying. Therefore, Kasparov grabs this pawn on b5. And now after the trade, we got to the critical moment of the game. So here black had an obvious move, rook takes a2, similar to the previous variation. However, Carlsen did not play it. Now what's the reason? Well, in case of rook takes a2, although the position remains to be balanced, but it's still not that simple for black, and black still needs to work their way to equality, because white has this pretty strong passer. And there is an idea for white to just get queen off the way, somewhere here maybe, and after that to start pushing this pawn forward. Maybe put the rook behind it, there's a bishop that supports it. Somehow my arrows are wrong today. This way the bishop supports it. And therefore it's still not that simple for black to equalize the game. Therefore Carlsen wanted something better, and instead of playing rook takes a2 straight away, he played queen to b8, offering a trade of queens. And although Carlsen was young, but you know, due to increased intake of magnesium and calcium, he was a very special boy. He was already a GM around that time, he won a couple international tournaments, and even in this match he also got a draw against Garry in the other game. Therefore, he was already pretty strong. However, queen b8 is a move in the wrong direction. Now, Carlsen was probably expecting Garry to just trade off queens, and after that, indeed, black would have a great game, putting pressure, getting one of these pawns back, and life would be great for black. However, Garry was relentless in following the rule to take as a mistake, and once again he said, no way I'm gonna help you to bring your rook to a good position. Instead, I'm gonna use this exchange, and I'm gonna force it on my terms. And he played pawn a4, which is a great move. So now black has nothing to do, because these pawns are very strong, they have to trade. But notice the difference. Now, this pawn on a2 is no longer hanging. It's number one. Number two is this pawn is actually pretty close to the square of promotion. It's very annoying for black. Plus, the rook is still there, not on that active position on b8, and black has to spend that time additionally to put the rook right there. Plus, I gotta say that in this game there was some simply bad luck for Carlsen. So here he played rook to b8, and it turns out to be a mistake, but it's something which is probably impossible to see, and I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of players would play this move. So the correct move was rook a to b8. We'll see why after a couple moves. So that's why I'm saying that it's a very unobvious tactical mistake, and it was just a little bit of a bad luck for Carlsen. So here rook b8 looks totally logical, attacks this pawn on b5, therefore Kasparov pushes it, so that the pawn is now defended by the bishop. And Carlsen goes knight g4, putting pressure to this bishop. He wants to take it away so that after that the pawn on b6 may fall. What should white do now? In such positions, we tend to be reactive. We start thinking about our opponent's threats and how we can counter them. But in reality, this brings us to the next rule. Offense is the best defense. Just forget about his threats for a second and ask yourself, how can I attack? How can I move forward and create threats? And that mode of thinking sometimes gives you a number of interesting ideas that wouldn't come to your mind otherwise. Something like rook to c7 to counter that pawn. Or maybe a pawn to e5, move forward, that opens up this attack to the black rook. And by the way, that is why I said a couple of moves earlier that it would be better for black to move that rook to b8 so that now it's not on the line of attack. But of course, it was very hard to foresee all that stuff. And finally, the move that Garry played, pawn to b7. And the move was so good that Magnus just resigned. Now, what the heck is going on here? I understand it is annoying when grandmasters resign somewhat prematurely, but it's not really the case. It's just that they can calculate what's going to happen next. So after rook takes b7, Garry would play pawn e5 this way, and now it attacks these both rooks, and they can't escape. So Garry would grab at least one of them and would end up with a better position. But alternatively, there is not much black can do, because otherwise they have to get this rook out of the attack somewhere. And if they do it, then there is rook to c8, and that is just totally overwhelming for black. On the next move is literally one of the strongest moves ever in chess that you can play, because white is going to get the rook, promote a new queen, and even after that, he's also going to get this knight because of the double attack. So right here. So that's literally gaining 17 points of material, if I count correctly, within one move rook to c8. So that's why Carlsen resigned. Now, here's a quick recap of the 3 rules we've been talking about. So one of them is complete your development before attacking. Do not start to jump forward early in an opening before you completed development of your pieces. So that was the one thing. And then a couple of moves later, we can see that both of them were following the rule to take as a mistake consistently throughout the game. And actually, it was a pivotal moment of the game where Magnus underestimated the power of this move. He automatically assumed that Garry would take, but instead Garry still followed to take as a mistake rule, and that actually allowed Garry to overtake. And here, after a couple moves, the final interesting moment is that when your opponent attacks you, instead of being reactive, ask yourself, how can I counterattack, because offense is the best defense. If you enjoyed these rules, I have a free masterclass where I dive deeper into this. You can access it by clicking the link up there or down below in the description, and hopefully I'll see you in my next videos.